We spend a lot of time on this show analyzing statutes, legal precedents, judicial rulings, all the operational mechanics of law. But before we even get to the laws themselves, I think we have to ask a more foundational question, which is, where does the very idea of justice come from?
Right.
Is it something we just invent?
Right.
Does it change from one culture to the next? Or is there maybe a universal standard that humanity is supposed to abide by?
And that is the core philosophical and legal dilemma that this deep dive is all about.
Okay.
Today, we're taking a magnifying glass to a really powerful stack of sources. Research compiled by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir, who's a respected constitutional and corporate lawyer. And his work specifically compares three, dramatically different documents to find a common, enduring thread.
And those three frameworks,
yeah,
they really define a journey spanning over 1,000 years. We're looking at justice as a divine command in the Qur'an and Sunnah, then as a global human right from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948.
A huge leap forward in time.
Exactly. And finally, as a national foundation, codified in Pakistan's Objective Resolution of 1949. That's an incredibly ambitious scope.
It is. It really is. But by tracing this concept across such diverse origins, you have religious ethics, global consensus, national constitutional law, the mission of the source material becomes really clear.
Which is?
To extract this powerful conclusion that justice might be the only value that's truly accepted by every single civilization, every major religion, and, every constitution. It's humanity's attempt to create a final shared moral language.
A final moral language.
And the source material provides some pretty compelling, detailed evidence that this language is, in fact, universal.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Our journey begins not in a courtroom, not in parliament, but in 7th century Arabia. The source argues that Islam introduced justice not just as a set of rules for, social engineering, but as something far more demanding.
A divine moral imperative.
Divine moral imperative. It wasn't just recommended, it was foundational to the entire faith.
Exactly. And when we use that phrase, divine moral imperative, we're emphasizing that this idea of justice is non-negotiable. Its source is higher than human whim or politics or tribal structures. It sets an absolute standard that you just can't bargain away.
And this standard is codified in the core Quranic injunctions.
It is.
And the most challenging quote that's cited in the sources is from Surah An-Nisa, verse 4.135. It seems to set a standard of objectivity that is, frankly, almost impossibly high for typical human behavior.
Can I read it?
Please.
It says, "O you who believe, stand firmly for justice, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or your relatives."
Okay, we have to pause there. We need to really internalize what that command is demanding.
It's an extreme, almost unnatural level of personal sacrifice and detachment. For millennia, human societies operated on the bedrock of self-preservation and group loyalty.
Of course.
Loyalty to your family, your clan, your tribe. That was the ethical and, the pragmatic mandate. If a family member was in the wrong, you protected them. It was about survival.
So this command is essentially asking for a kind of self-negation in favor of an abstract principle.
Precisely. It overrides the most basic human instinct, kinship. To rule against your parents or your immediate relatives or, and this is the key part, even yourself, which means admitting your own guilt or your own error, is to hold truth and fairness above the very bonds that define your existence.
So the source argues this establishes what? The highest possible benchmark for judicial integrity.
For judicial integrity and moral objectivity known to law, it's a duty that transcends loyalty, and it's what transforms a community from just a tribe into a civilized society governed by abstract law.
I have to ask, though, isn't that fundamentally impossible for human beings to consistently enforce? How did a society so rooted in those tribal loyalties, which is how the entire globe operated at that time, how did they manage to internalize or even enforce such a radical demand?
Well, that's where the link to spirituality comes in. It's not just a law. It's enforced through belief and through a direct connection between justice and piety. And this leads us to the complementary verse from Surah Al-Ma'idah 5.8, which connects justice directly to your spiritual standing. It frames it as a universal human requirement, not just a sectarian rule. It says, "O mankind, be just. This is closest to piety."
Let's break down that concept of piety, or taqwa. The source describes it as, what, spiritual excellence or consciousness of God. So why is justice the closest thing to it?
Taqwa is often understood as a kind of mindfulness, or guarding oneself against wrongdoing by being constantly aware of a higher standard.
Okay.
Now, if you look at human failings, Most of them stem from selfishness, from greed, from bias toward our own group. Injustice is the ultimate result of that self-prioritization.
Right, it's putting yourself or your group first.
Exactly. So by stating that being just meaning being perfectly objective and fair is the closest action to taqwa, the framework elevates ethical governance to the level of worship.
So you can't be spiritually excellent if you're unjust.
You can't. It reframes ethical behavior as a spiritual necessity, which makes it non-optional for a believer. And this is the crucial enforcement mechanism for that incredibly high standard set in the other verse.
That makes sense. It institutionalizes morality. And what is perhaps equally revolutionary is just how universal this command was. It explicitly rejected bias and tribalism, instructing, and do not let the hatred of a people lead you to injustice.
That statement is foundational to what we now call international law, but centuries before the concept even existed.
Right.
It recognizes hatred and prejudice as the most potent threats to objectivity. It's not asking you to like your enemy or even forgive them.
No, it's just saying you have to be fair.
It mandates that even in the context of conflict, you must uphold fairness. The legal status of an adversary cannot be reduced by your emotional state or your political relationship with them.
So it's a deliberate, proactive rejection of that old principle of, what was it, vae victis, woe to the conquered.
Exactly. It's an insistence on the rule of law, even for those you despise.
So this framework, it directly challenged injust, replaced the existing tribal legal structure.
It had to.
Tribal law was inherently restrictive. Justice was often distributive. It depended on whether the wronged party belonged to a strong tribe or a weak one.
Absolutely.
This new system just demolished that. It demanded justice prevail against friend or foe, majority or minority, ruler or ruled, Muslim or non-Muslim.
It was a revolution in legal thought. It introduced a kind of horizontal accountability. Ancient systems often allowed the ruler or the ruling class to stand above the law.
Of course, the divine right of kings and all that.
Right. This framework established the protection of the most vulnerable, the minority and non-adherent, and it enforced accountability upon the most powerful, the ruler. It means your legal standing is purely determined by evidence and law, devoid of your affiliation, your wealth, or your position in the power structure.
And to summarize the integrity of this revolutionary early framework, the source provides 5 defining characteristics that ensure its non-negotiable nature. Let's maybe elaborate on those 5 points to see why this system was designed to resist corruption.
Absolutely. First, it must be objective. Justice can't rely on feelings or political expediency. It has to rely solely on facts and evidence. This establishes a universal standard of proof.
Okay, so facts over feelings.
Second, it must be non-tribal. And this is the explicit rejection of prioritizing loyalty over truth, ensuring the system serves truth, not just the survival of a specific group.
Which we've already seen is a radical idea.
Radically so. Third, it has to be non-political. The administration of justice cannot be wielded as a tool for acquiring power, maintaining power, or punishing political rivals. It has to operate independently of the state's interests.
And the last 2 are crucial because they address its universality, even though it has a divine origin.
Precisely. It must be non-religious in its application. Although its source is divine, its application is universal. The rights and protections extend equally to adherents of all faiths, or none. This ensures the legal system is a refuge for everyone within the state's boundaries.
And finally,
it must be non-negotiable. Justice cannot be traded away for political expediency, for peace treaties, for economic gain. It is an absolute right.
so this set of 5 characteristics, it basically provided a blueprint for what we now call the rule of law. It places the integrity of the judicial process above everything else.
All other considerations, yes.
This sounds incredibly idealistic. I mean, if these principles were introduced in a world dominated by raw power and tribal identity, how quickly did they break down? Or were they truly practiced? Here's where it gets really interesting.
And this transition is so critical because principles are only as strong as their practical application. The source directs us to a historical ruling that instantly demonstrated the disruptive, non-negotiable nature of this new ethical core.
We have to understand the social context first.
Yes, tribal law was brutal. If you offended someone from a stronger tribe, your life was forfeit, or maybe compensated for by your own tribe. Identity was the law.
So loyalty wasn't just a preference, it was the mechanism of survival. If you didn't support your own, your entire tribe was vulnerable.
Exactly. The system was based on mutual defense and communal honor, not individual rights. Now you introduce a legal system that says, if your family member is wrong, you must rule against them.
that challenges the very foundation of how society was organized.
The entire thing.
Okay, so in this context of intense tribal loyalty, the source cites a specific dispute that arose. It involved, and I'm quoting here, 2 Muslims and a Jew.
Oh.
Can you detail the facts of that case? Because they really illuminate the tension between the old and the new systems.
Well, while the exact details can vary a little bit across different historical accounts, the core issue was a property dispute, or in some tellings, a matter of theft. And the evidence, the sequence of events, the physical proof, the witnesses, it all pointed toward the guilt of the 2 Muslim individuals. And thus, it supported the claim being made by the Jewish individual.
Now, in the prevailing Arab tribal mindset, the natural path, the path of political survival and communal cohesion, would be to find some way to rule in favor of the 2 community members. That's what loyalty demanded.
It was more than demanded. It was expected. Siding with the outsider would have been seen as a betrayal of the nascent Muslim community. It could have caused internal dissent, weakened their political standing against external rivals.
So it was a moment where political gain directly opposed ethical principle.
A classic test case. And the Prophet ruled unequivocally in favor of the Jew because the evidence supported him. And the source states that this ruling shocked the Arab tribal mindset. Why did this single decision, based purely on evidence, cause such profound shockwaves?
I mean, it seems so obvious to us now. The evidence points one way, you rule that way.
But it wasn't obvious then. It was a symbolic and pragmatic severance from tribalism. By ruling in favor of the Jewish individual, the Prophet was communicating that the new social contract was not based on shared ethnicity or religion or lineage.
But on what?
On an impartial commitment to truth. The shock was the realization that their new tribe was defined by justice, not by blood. It meant that adherence to the law was more sacred than group solidarity.
So this single act established the absolute independence of the judiciary from executive power and from communal pressure.
Absolutely. It effectively told every member of that society, including the 2 Muslims who lost the case,
Yeah.
Your identity is irrelevant when the law speaks. That is revolutionary.
It is.
This decision wasn't just a legal outcome, it was a defining statement about the philosophical core of that civilization. And we can distill this core message into 4 profound operational principles that define a civilization governed by objectivity.
Okay, let's go through them. First, justice is above identity.
Meaning who you are, Muslim, non-Muslim, Arab, non-Arab, is immaterial in the courtroom. Your status is derived from the law, not from your group affiliation.
Second, justice is above loyalty.
And this supersedes that basic, fundamental human need to protect your family or your community. The pursuit of truth has to take precedence over emotional and communal ties. This is the hardest principle for any human society to maintain.
I would agree with that. Third, justice is above power.
This establishes the principle of accountability. It ensures that the rules apply equally to the weakest individual and the most powerful ruler. The ruler must be prepared to face the same justice demanded of the ruled.
And fourth, and this is so relevant today, justice is above emotion.
Critical. This is so critical in modern terms. It means the law cannot be swayed by public opinion, by media pressure, by sympathy, or by anger. It requires a cold, rational, evidence-based assessment. This historical ruling was a preemptive rejection of identity politics and populism. It defined a new metric for civilized life.
It's incredible. If you look at the fundamental failures of governance across history, they almost always boil down to violating one of those 4 points. Prioritizing identity, rewarding loyalty, abusing power, or pandering to emotion.
Every single time.
So the ability of that ancient system to operationalize these abstract principles through a really shocking case ruling, that's what makes it relevant to our next major framework, the global consensus.
And that ability to abstract justice from subjective human factors is the foundational contribution here. It demonstrates that the concept works when it's enforced objectively. And that provides the historical validation that was needed for the world to later adopt universal standards, even if those standards were secularly derived.
And that brings us to the next section. We're transitioning now from the moral imperative of the 7th century to the 20th century's global imperative. After, the unspeakable trauma and systemic cruelty of the Second World War, the world was forced to confront the absolute failure of nationally defined law.
It was a breaking point.
The realization was stark. If we allow nation-states to define what a human being is and what justice means purely within their own borders, the result is mass atrocity.
The horrors of the Holocaust, the sheer scale of the war crimes, it proved that national sovereignty needed an ethical checkmate. The UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was born out of this existential necessity.
So it was a global attempt to find ethical constants.
Yes, constants that must supersede political boundaries and state ideology. The consensus was that universal values were no longer a luxury, they were a requirement for the survival of the species.
So the United Nations in 1948 codified this consensus.
Yeah.
What are the UDHR's foundational declarations that link it back to that ancient moral framework we were just discussing?
The UDHR's preamble establishes the concept of intrinsic, non-derogable human worth. It's a secular mirror to the divine mandate. It declares that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
And fundamental.
Fundamentally, everyone is entitled to equal protection of the law. This is a complete dismantling of any system, racial, political, or class-based, that seeks to assign different values to different people. It's the global ratification of the principle that justice is non-tribal.
What's truly fascinating, and what the source really emphasizes, is the deep echo between the specific articles of the UDHR and those earlier Quranic ethics.
The parallels are striking.
This convergence strongly suggests that justice isn't cultural, it's universally human. Let's maybe move beyond just listing the articles and talk about their function in the context of preventing those post-war atrocities.
Good idea. Let's start with the most basic necessity, the right to life, Article 3. Defining this as a universal right means no state, regardless of its ideology, can arbitrarily extinguish a life. It places the ultimate boundary on state power, reflecting the sanctity of life inherent in those ancient ethical systems.
And there's the prohibition of torture, Article 5. This is a direct response to the brutalization witnessed during the war.
Absolutely. Article 5 states, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." This establishes a baseline of human dignity that you just cannot breach, even in times of war or conflict. It operationalizes that principle that justice is above emotion. The state can't be driven by vengeance or cruelty.
And the right to equality, Article 7, then enshrines that non-tribal structure globally. All are equal before the law, entitled to equal protection without discrimination.
Right. And critically, the procedural rights follow, which are the mechanisms that ensure objectivity.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I mean, the protection against arbitrary arrest, Article 9, and the right to fair trial, Article 10. If the state can just arrest you without cause or hold you without a fair, prompt, and public hearing, the rule of law collapses. It just becomes the arbitrary assertion of power.
So these procedural rights are essential checks on the executive and law enforcement branches.
Exactly. They ensure due process is followed, preventing power from overriding truth.
We also see parallels in economic and personal freedom. Protection of property, Article 17, and freedom of belief, Article 18.
The protection of property as a human right ensures that the state can't arbitrarily seize the livelihoods of its citizens. It guarantees a kind of economic stability and justice.
And freedom of belief.
The protection of conscience, freedom of belief, thought, and religion in Article 18. That's the UDHR's a non-sectarian equivalent of the principle that justice must be applied universally, regardless of faith. Your legal status and your rights are entirely independent of your spiritual adherence.
The power of this section, for me, is in the validation it provides. What was once a divinely mandated set of principles centuries ahead of its time became the consensus bedrock required for global survival.
Yeah.
It shows that whether you're driven by a theological command or by pragmatic necessity after a catastrophe, humanity lands on the exact same structure of objective justice.
The convergence is undeniable. The UDHR translated those abstract, universal, and non-negotiable principles into actionable, secular international law. And in doing so, it confirmed that these aren't cultural inventions. They are inherent requirements for a functional, ethical, human existence. Which brings us directly to our third framework, which attempts to synthesize both of these worlds. So we now examine how a newly formed nation, Pakistan, chose to define itself. It's synthesizing the ancient moral imperative with the brand new global consensus, and it achieves this constitutional definition just 1 year after the UDHR was signed.
The objective resolution passed in 1949 was a colossal challenge. This new nation had to establish a modern democratic state while, honoring the spiritual and ethical traditions that inspired its creation.
It had to build a constitutional framework sturdy enough to reconcile two potentially competing concepts: divine sovereignty and popular democracy.
And justice was the chosen anchor for this synthesis.
It had to be. The core declarations of the resolution clearly articulate this balancing act. The first declaration addressed the ultimate authority: Sovereignty belongs to Almighty Allah alone.
Which is the direct acknowledgement of that divine moral imperative we discussed in the first section. But immediately following that, the resolution translates that abstract sovereignty into a modern system.
Yes, it says, authority shall be exercised through the chosen representatives of the people.
And that's the constitutional masterstroke, isn't it?
It is. It ensures the state's ethical legitimacy derives from the highest source, Allah, guaranteeing that non-negotiable standard of justice. But the practical power, the mechanism of governance, is vested in the people. It establishes a democratic representative structure.
So this bridge ensures that the state is accountable both to its foundational religious principles and to the will of its citizens.
Correct. And the third declaration clearly sets the state's mandate for achieving those universal ethical principles we saw in the UDHR. It states, the state shall ensure justice, equality, and freedom. This is the national commitment to operationalize those shared values.
So the resolution served as Pakistan's vital constitutional bridge.
A bridge between Islamic jurisprudence, with its emphasis on objective, non-tribal justice, and the necessary requirements of modern global human rights established by the UDHR.
Let's spend some time on the legal status of this document, because that's critical to understanding its impact. It started as the preamble to the 1973 Constitution. What's the difference between a preamble and substantive law, and why did the government later make it a substantive part of the Constitution through something called Article 2A?
That distinction is crucial. A preamble is essentially the spirit, the guiding philosophy, or the intentions of the drafters. It instructs how the rest of the document should be interpreted, but typically you can't go to court and sue the government for violating the preamble.
So it's inspirational but not strictly enforceable. It's the mission statement.
Exactly, it's the mission statement. However, when the objective resolution was transformed into substantive law through Article 2A in 1985, it gained legal teeth.
It became enforceable.
It did. Article 2A declares that the principles and provisions of the objective resolution shall form a substantive part of the Constitution and be enforceable. This means the commitments to justice, equality, freedom, and the protection of minorities. They stopped being mere political aspirations.
Okay.
They became legally enforceable constitutional mandates that can be and have been used by the superior courts to review and strike down legislation or executive actions that violate these core principles. It solidified the supremacy of justice in the national legal hierarchy.
So that makes the Constitution itself a vehicle for enforcing the moral imperative. It ties the state's hands to prevent regression toward arbitrary rule. What specific guarantees built upon this concept of non-negotiable justice were enshrined?
They're comprehensive, and they're designed to prevent those 4 historical failures we identified earlier. You see the explicit guarantee of justice and equality for all, reinforcing the non-tribal rule.
Right.
You have the assurance of rights for all, which mirrors the UDHR. And structurally, you find accountability for rulers and the strict enforcement of the rule of law, ensuring justice is above power.
And, most telling, reflecting that original shock ruling from the 7th century, is the assurance of freedom of conscience and the strong protection of minorities.
And these elements demonstrate the constitutional embodiment of ruling against self-interest. Since the majority community holds democratic power, the Constitution has to explicitly mandate that this majority cannot use its political strength to oppress the minority or dictate belief.
So it's an ethical demand for objectivity, operationalized.
It is. It's operationalized in Article 36, which specifically mandates the protection of the legitimate rights and interests of minorities. And it's constantly reinforced by judicial precedent, like the Supreme Court's landmark 2014 judgment on minority rights. So the objective resolution, therefore, is a direct constitutional expression of that universal duty to place truth above loyalty.
What's fascinating here is, when you put these 3 frameworks, the divine moral imperative, the global human right, and the national constitutional duty side by side, you discover not just similarity, but near identity in the resulting legal duties. This is where the source's core thesis is really proven. Let's look at the direct legal comparison.
This comparative analysis, it reveals that the fundamental requirements for a civilized society are structurally constant, regardless of your philosophical starting point. It shows that history repeatedly demonstrates that only objective justice provides stability.
Let's start with the source of duty. The origin of the mandate for justice differs pretty significantly. In the Islamic framework, the duty is a divine command. For the UN framework, it's derived from a universal human right based on inherent dignity. And in Pakistan's context, it's a specific constitutional duty from Article 2A.
And the implications here are deep. The duty is the same, but the authoritative backing shifts depending on the listener. Whether you obey a divine law, a global consensus, or the supreme law of your land, the practical demand objective justice remains constant.
So the source of legitimacy may vary, but the content of the ethical obligation is stable and absolute.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move to equal protection. How is the principle of fairness to all ensured across these frameworks? The Islamic tradition is fiercely defensive of the outsider, demanding no injustice even to enemies.
The highest bar.
The UN guarantees equal protection everywhere. How does Pakistan's system operationalize this through its specific constitutional articles?
Pakistan's framework uses a cascade of articles to institutionalize non-discrimination. Article 25 is the core principle. It guarantees equality of all citizens before the law. But it's supported by others. Article 4 protects the rights of individuals to be treated in accordance with law. Article 9 guarantees security of person and liberty, protecting against arbitrary state action. And Article 14 ensures the inviolability of the dignity of man.
So together, these articles function as the national legal architecture to enforce that original ethical mandate, that hatred of a people must not lead to injustice.
They transform a moral ideal into an enforceable right.
This detail is necessary because it shows the mechanism. It's not just a nice phrase, it's a series of legal barriers. Okay, let's examine accountability in minorities. Who is responsible for enforcing this duty, and who is protected by it?
The principle of accountability ensures that power is never absolute. In the early Islamic framework, the ruler was accountable to an independent judicial system. The UN system enforces the accountability of states internationally through covenants and mechanisms of scrutiny. Nationally, Pakistan ensures accountability before courts and parliament, using judicial review and legislative oversight to check executive power. The common thread is that no one, regardless of their office, is exempt from the law.
And regarding minorities, this is where that duty to rule against your own group is really tested. Both the Islamic framework and Pakistan's constitution.
Yeah.
You mentioned Article 36 and that 2014 Supreme Court judgment. They explicitly mandate the protection of minorities.
Yes, and that's paralleled by the UN's general rights for all peoples. This is the legal safeguard against the tyranny of the majority, which is really the modern manifestation of tribalism.
Explain that a little more.
Well, in a democracy, the political majority risks becoming the ethical tribe. Constitutional safeguards like Article 36 and the subsequent aggressive stance taken by the Supreme Court in 2014, they ensure that the Constitution acts as the ultimate guarantor of minority rights. It prevents the majority from using its political mandate to enforce sectarian or discriminatory policies.
So it's a direct constitutional enactment of the principle that justice is above identity and loyalty.
It is.
This overwhelming convergence, where three systems born in wildly different contexts arrive at the same legal framework, brings us to the source's ultimate analytical finding, the ratio decidendi, the core reason for the decision, which is really the heart of this deep dive.
And the conclusion isn't just a summary, it's a profound philosophical statement derived from all this evidence.
Which is?
Justice is the only value accepted by every civilization, every religion, every court, every constitution. It is humanity's final moral language.
Okay, let's dedicate some significant time to unpacking why this is the final moral language. Why not love or freedom or faith?
Because justice is the precondition for all those other values. Love is subjective, it binds groups together, but it can exclude others.
Sure.
Freedom without justice just devolves into anarchy or the oppression of the weak by the strong. And faith, by its very nature, is exclusive. It distinguishes between adherence and non-adherence.
The justice.
Justice, however, is objective. It's mathematical, impartial. It is the language of structure and truth. It alone offers a framework that can integrate the enemy and the stranger into the legal system without requiring affection or shared belief.
So justice is the operational metric of civilization.
Yeah.
When all else fails, when tribes clash, when political ideologies dissolve, when faith systems differ fundamentally, the only shared language left is the language of objective fairness.
Precisely. The moment you argue for your case, you are arguing for justice. Even if you are trying to acquire power unjustly, you're still compelled to frame your argument in terms of what is right or fair according to some recognized standards.
That's a great point.
This inescapable adherence to the concept proves its universality. Every actor on the world stage, from a litigant in a local court to a nation addressing the UN, ultimately appeals to the same abstract standard of truth, impartiality, and due process. This makes justice the singular, non-negotiable moral currency of human interaction, transcending ideology, history, and geography.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the consistency we've observed across the Qur'an, the UDHR, and the objective resolution, it demonstrates that the pursuit of objective justice is the single common denominator of human progress and stability.
It seems to be.
Let's just summarize the historical impact one last time to bring it all together. The journey began with the Qur'an establishing justice as a spiritual and legal duty, shocking the loyalty-based tribal world into accepting objectivity.
Then, after a period of global regression, the UDHR declared justice a global human right, establishing that indispensable ethical foundation required for peaceful interaction between states in the modern era.
And finally, Pakistan's objective resolution made justice the foundation of its national identity, demonstrating how a modern state can structurally synthesize divine ethics and global human rights into an enforceable constitutional framework.
And this continuity provides a clear moral framework, which is captured beautifully by the source's conclusion. Justice is not merely a law, it is a light.
That reframing is profound. If justice is a light rather than a rule, what are the inherent strengths and weaknesses of that metaphor?
Well, a law can be manipulated, it can be amended, or ignored selectively.
Right.
A light cannot. Light, by its nature, reveals everything indiscriminately. It shines on the guilty and the innocent, the friend and the foe, and the source states the stark reality of this.
Which is?
Where justice shines, nations flourish. Where justice dies, nations collapse.
And flourishing means systemic trust, economic predictability, internal peace.
All of which are contingent on the certainty that the law will be applied objectively. Collapse is the inevitable result when identity or political gain or loyalty casts the system into darkness.
So it suggests that justice isn't a political philosophy you choose, it's an operating principle you have to adhere to, or your society will functionally cease to operate successfully regardless of how much wealth or military power you possess.
Exactly. Without that objective light, the machinery of the state will break down.
When justice dies, the foundational trust required for any collective social or economic endeavor it vanishes.
Why invest? Why obey? Why cooperate? The system reverts to raw power dynamics. And the final warning the source leaves us with is a profound ethical statement. A world without justice becomes a world without humanity.
Why?
Because without the objectivity of justice, all that's left is the prioritization of self-interest and the raw assertion of power. And that strips away our shared human dignity and our capacity for civilization itself.
This has been a deeply insightful look at how the idea of justice, despite originating from these vastly different authoritative sources, converges on the same non-negotiable standards. The consistency across a divine moral code, a global secular consensus, and a modern national constitution it's truly remarkable.
It is.
And the universal agreement seems to lie in that required self-discipline. The mandate to rule against yourself, your family, or your immediate group.
And that self-discipline is the challenge of our time. Since justice is defined as being non-tribal and non-negotiable, requiring us to prioritize evidence and truth above our own identity, this raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over.
Which is?
Given the increasing pressure of modern tribalism, which is amplified by partisan politics and social media echo chambers, what practical, enforceable measures are required in modern politics and law to ensure that justice remains truly objective and above emotion?
A huge question.
If the human instinct is constantly trying to drag us back to prioritizing loyalty over truth, what specific institution, be it the court system, parliamentary checks and balances, or a specific constitutional article like Article 2A, carries the most weight in enforcing this ultimate moral duty today?
Yep.
How do we build systems robust enough to hold up when human nature seeks self-preservation above fairness?
That is the ultimate practical test for any modern democracy. Thank you for guiding us through this material and exposing the universal moral thread that seems to bind all civilization.
My pleasure.
We hope this deep dive has given you a richer understanding of why justice is not just law, but humanity's essential, final moral language. We'll see you next time.